we're getting way ahead of ourselves here, but let's start at the beginning. I'll ask each of the panelists to comment a little bit on their particular areas of expertise, and then we'll open it up to questions and go from there. So we'd like Patti Bellock to begin with her reminiscences of Charles Comiskey and his impact on the game.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I want to thank Dr. Fletcher for all his time and effort. I don't know where he is. Oh, there he is. For all the effort that he has put into this, because he first contacted me by email, and I was down in the Capitol building, and that was last winter, and I think we had 10 bills going that morning. And so he met me. I said, if you can come at 6:30 in the morning, I'll be glad to meet you. And so he was there at 6:30 in the morning in the freezing cold. And I just admire his love of the game of baseball and his interest in this, the Black Sox issue and all of baseball in Chicago. So my expertise is not in the Black Sox. In fact, my sister is sitting here tonight, Mary Sharon Collins, and her husband, Bill Collins. And I think growing up, I would have to admit, Mary Sharon, I don't think that our family ever really talked about the Black Sox. So it's something that I've just read about in recent years. It was, I think, probably because our family was so busy at the time going to the baseball games and running the baseball, the Comiskey Park and the White Sox, that the talk of the Black Sox just never really was very much of the discussion. Certainly there was a lot of discussion about my grandfather, Louis Comiskey, and my great-grandfather, Charles Comiskey. And so our family is a baseball family. I consider Charles Comiskey to be one of the major people in baseball throughout the United States and actually throughout the world. As you can see, if you read any of the books, that he wanted to promote baseball, not only in America, but throughout the world, and he took them on a world tour, which when you think about it back in those days, is really something to think of, taking a baseball team around the world. And I think he was going to take them to South America also if the Black Sox scandal had not happened at that time. But it's great to see so many Sox fans here, especially when it's been Cubs mania for the last couple of weeks. And just to say, I think that we grew up at Comiskey Park all the time, my sister and I. My dad, which a lot of people don't understand because the Comiskey family kind of overshadows it, but my dad was John Rigney, and he was a pitcher for the White Sox, which a lot of you may know his name. And he was a very good pitcher, we've heard. He was played in the late 30s and early 40s. So we never saw him play, but he then went into World War II and hurt his arm during World War II. So when he came back, he was very active in the White Sox, and he had married my mother before he went there. In fact, my sister was born when he was overseas. So then when he came back, his role in the White Sox was he was head of the farm team. So he developed really the team that grew to be in the late 50s. He signed Minnie Minoso, Louis Aparicio, a lot of those people who became one of the most famous teams the White Sox had. But back to some of the stories about my great-grandfather, which is interesting. 2 years ago, my daughter has now moved to Boston, and I went through Cooperstown, and so I was near it, so I got off the expressway and drove down there. Being that all of you are here tonight, probably a lot of you have been to Cooperstown too, but I was really excited to see it because I knew that my great-grandfather was in the first class of the Hall of Fame, 1939 class, I think. So when we got there, I peered through the opening, and there it was in the first thing. And so I had always heard about everything about him being an owner, and a little bit about him being a manager and a player. But in the Hall of Fame, there's only a couple of sentences to describe his career. And one of the most important things about Charles Comiskey, which maybe some of you know, is that he was the first baseman to play off the bag. And that, in the 3-sentence description or whatever it is in Cooperstown, that was one of the main things that they talked about. And so his desire when he built when he formed the team and then built the park in 1910, the original park, although there was an original park at 22nd Street, he was Irish, his heritage was from Ireland, so a lot of you, people always think, in fact my son-in-law still thinks that my daughter is Polish, but Comiskey is a very Irish name, and so when he had the first game, he actually brought some of the sod over from Ireland to put around home plate, and then faced it in the shape of a Gaelic C for the Comiskey. So there's a few little things that we heard about his history, but his main desire and love was of baseball and to develop the team. And I think that through the years, that love was brought about through my mother, who, when my grandfather Louis Comiskey died, my mother assumed the role as the president of the White Sox, which at the time, during when Louis died, when he died, my grandmother took it over, which is pretty interesting because back in those days it was very unusual to have a woman be the head of a baseball team. I don't think in the major leagues at that time there ever was one. And in reading the history about Charles Comiskey, my great-grandfather, he was the first, and I don't know if it's happened since then, sole player to own a baseball team also. And I'm not sure, because nowadays most baseball teams are owned by conglomerates. I'm not sure if anybody else has ever owned one by themselves. But when Lewis died, my grandmother took it over, and it was a bad financial time at the time, and the stories were that the bank and some others tried to take it away from them. So my mother quit college at the time. She was a freshman, I think, at Northwestern, and went into the baseball park. So she and my grandmother actually ran the Chicago White Sox for 13 years, which is a part of history that a lot of people don't realize, that they had that desire from my grandfather and my great-grandfather to keep it going and to keep it into the family business, that they kept that going for quite a long time until they finally eventually sold it to Bill Beck, who I think, again, was a man who had a strong desire, for the love of the game of baseball, not just as a money maker for business. So we spent a lot of weekends, a lot of days, my sister and I, in fact, we even attributed part of our weight problem to spending so much time at a baseball game and getting up to have popcorn and Coke and all that stuff during the, 7th inning stretch in those times. But today I talked to a cousin of mine there are very few Comiskys left. My Uncle Charlie lives in the same town that I do, and I tried to see if I could get them to come here tonight, but they had just come back from Wisconsin. But there are very few people left, but I do have one cousin that lives out in Arizona who actually worked for the White Sox right after the Black Sox scandal. And so I spoke to her today on the telephone, and she was giving me a few stories that I wrote down that I thought would be of interest to you because they referred to the time. She was not there during the Black Sox scandal, but she did work under Harry Grabner, and she said that, of course, we being, from the Comiskey family, think that my great-grandfather was a wonderful person, and we refuse to believe, a lot of the stories that have been told about him, except that maybe he was cheap. But she said that at the time when an investigator came into the ballpark to find out about what was going on, Harry Grabner came into my great-grandfather and he said, Charlie, he said, show them the contracts. I have them right here. I want you to show them so that they know that you have paid the players as much or more so than any of the league players are paid. And he said, his quote was, "No, Harry, my friends know me for what I am, and others will only believe what they choose to believe." And so he was a man he was a philanthropist, he was very civic-minded, he always gave all the military people free entrance into the ballpark. He always looked at politicians as that they were somebody that were, part of the landscape of the city of Chicago, and they were always welcome into the ballpark. But she told me, in the year that the White Sox won the World Series before the Black Sox scandal, she said that the story was that he gave his entire percentage of the owner's winnings to the team players and to the Red Cross. He took none of it for himself. So the stories that come back that are written in our family books are that this was a man that was very philanthropic, very generous. She told us a story also about a newsman. Dan, you might be interested in this. They came up to them when there was the funeral, and there was a lady weeping with a baby, and she ran up to where the casket was. And so the newsman came up to her and said, "You must have been a very close friend of his." And she said, "No." She said, "We never met him at all." But she said, "He paid for all of our coal, all of our fruits and vegetables, and he paid for every mortgage of every person on our block," and there was 10 of them on their block. So these are some of the stories that nobody ever seems to hear about Charles Comiskey that we think are important. And when she said that when Harry Grabner, when they were talking, they used to go up to Wisconsin, he was a lover of hunting and fishing, and that's where the story of the bards and people that would go up to Eagle River, Wisconsin, which is where he loved to go, and my grandfather loved to go. But the story is that my grandmother, Grace Comiskey, didn't like to go at all, and she said, "Leave me at the corner of State and Madison. I'd rather be there than way up in northern Wisconsin," because that was what Eagle River was quite a trek then without any major expressways. But one of the other stories that she said about Harry Grabner told him that one of the investigating committee of the scandal came up with another couple of men to Charles Comiskey's office one day, and she believed that the official was a court-appointed man and of some importance, and he wore a beard. And apparently when he walked into the office, he started to demand some things from my great-grandfather, speaking very authoritatively, and to say the least, started off with a total wrong approach with him. And she said, whereupon Uncle Charlie, she calls him, Charles Comiskey, stood up, pointed a finger at the man and said, now you sit down with your beard. And the man, according to Harry Grabner, sat down with his beard and he listened. So that was kind of an interesting story about what was going on. She also said about back up in Eagle River that one night when they were on the porch just talking about stories with her brother and sister, that he mentioned that one of the players, Seacon, I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation, came to him and just broke down and started crying when he told him about the scandal. So those are some of the personal stories that we had about a man that we feel was the founder of the Chicago White Sox and one of the co-founders of the American League, and a generous, generous man, a philanthropic man who loved the game of baseball and loved not only the game of baseball, but being a player himself. He loved the players of baseball, and that's why he wanted to showcase them throughout not only the United States, but the world. And we feel that he really was a man ahead of his time, and I appreciate being here. I hope I haven't gone on too much about the family history, but just want to tell you that I've only been to Cubs Park 3 times, and I think my sister has never been there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Patty. I have to add to that. Charles Comiskey is a huge figure in the history of Chicago and in the history of baseball. If you go to the Hall of Fame and you look at his plaque, he probably has more accomplishments in more aspects of the game than anybody. And I think it's true that his background as a player definitely gave him an edge back in that day in terms of assembling a team, because he really knew what he was looking for. He studied the game. The idea of playing off the base was just one of several innovations that he really should be credited for. You mentioned Harry Grabner. We're in the Historical Society, and I'm thinking history. Jerome Holtzman, with whom some of you may be familiar, he's the retired, longtime baseball columnist for the Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times. He's actually a member of the Writers' Wing of the Hall of Fame. Jerome has written extensively on the Black Sox, and he is my absolute mentor when it comes to baseball history and baseball knowledge. Harry Grabner in the movie is played by Merle Holtzman, who's Jerome's son. He was an actor in Hollywood back in the mid-'80s and late 80s. He's since gone over to the other side and is a screenwriter and a talent agent now. But that was probably his most prominent role. The young fellow with the curly hair and small glasses who played Harry Grabner is the son of Jerome Holtzman. So I wanted to ask one question about your grandfather. People thought he was Polish. He's actually Irish, but he was known as the Old Roman.
Right.
And wasn't that because of his nose?
Yes. That story is always around. But no, he was definitely all Irish. And that's where Comiskey Park, there was a lot of, like what I said about bringing he actually had that, don't ask me how they did that back in those days. But that's what the story is written in the book about that no, he's all Irish. That's what's funny about that. Kate, my uncle said to me, Patty, don't you know that Polish is K-I and Irish is K-E-Y?
It's an important distinction to know in Chicago.
Right.
Also, I would like to acknowledge John Rigby. He was indeed a huge guy in the history of the White Sox. I think that 59 pennant winning team, Bill Veeck did a little tinkering, acquiring Ted Kluszewski and a few others as the season went on. But in terms of actually putting together the team, Louis Aparicio, Jim Landis, that was John Rigby's doing. Another guy, very savvy baseball man, very big man in the history of the White Sox. So
I have a little story to add on that you might appreciate because I know you love baseball, is that Jack Brickhouse told my sister and I when we went, Jerry Reinsdorf was nice enough to invite us to christen the new ballpark when it was christened, however many years ago that was. And Jack Brickhouse told me this story that they were all disappointed because Chico Carrasco had been such a good shortstop. And that my dad went over and whispered in his ear, and he said, "Don't worry about a thing." He said, "I'm bringing up somebody that's going to be just as good or maybe better," and that was Louis Aparicio. And then one other story that I think you'd like that has nothing to do with the Black Sox, but that somebody sent me last year down in Springfield, was a letter from Frank Lane that was addressed to Nellie Fox in 1952. Maybe some of you have seen it, but it was telling him that he was probably only going to get a $1,000 raise, and he was only making $15,200 at the time, and he was pointing out how he had missed a few catches during the season, and that he thought that we could come to a good agreement on that within a couple of weeks.
There's a
Thank you.
picture of the Rigby family.
All right, I looked at that when she had that, Mary Sharon. That was from Extension Magazine. If anybody remembers that magazine, it was a Catholic magazine back in the 50s.
Thanks very much, Patty.